Good morning. How did the United States Marine Corps, an amphibious force forged to be a global 911, find itself fighting a 25-year land war in Southeast Asia? And how did it struggle to adapt to the complexities of Vietnam, redefine the very soul of the Corps? Dive deep, dive beyond. Today, in Paradroids, Podcast Synthetic. Prepare for data infusion. 3, 2, 1. Act 1. The Slow Inevitability, 1950 to 1967. First whispers. Advisors in a French war. There is a certain gravity to beginnings, a pull that often goes unnoticed until it becomes inescapable. Our story today does not begin with the thunder of artillery or the frantic chop of helicopter blades. It begins with a whisper, with a handful of men in a place that few Americans could find on a map. A place that would come to dominate the national consciousness for a generation. We are going back to the early 1950s, to a sliver of Southeast Asia, then known as French Indochina. The great colonial empires of the 19th century were crumbling, giving way to the new, starker realities of a bipolar world defined by the ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. In Vietnam, this global conflict found a local vessel in a fierce and determined independence movement, the Viet Minh, led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. They were nationalists, yes, but they were also communists, and in the calculus of the Cold War, that second attribute eclipsed the first. For the French, Vietnam was the bleeding edge of their collapsing empire, a war they were desperate to win to retain some semblance of global prestige after the humiliations of the Second World War. For the United States, the situation was far more complex. Washington had little love for old world colonialism, but it had an overriding, almost pathological, fear of communism's spread. This was the era of the domino theory, a deceptively simple idea that held if one nation in a region fell to communism, the others would inevitably topple in succession. And so, America found itself in the paradoxical position of bankrolling a French colonial war in the name of containing a communist threat. It was into this murky, politically charged environment that the first United States Marines arrived. They were not an invasion force. They were not there for combat. Not officially. They were advisors, a small contingent attached to the Military Assistance Advisory Group, or MAG, established in 1950. Their official mission was to provide technical assistance, to advise on logistics and training, to observe French tactics. These first Marines were a world away from the grunts who would later patrol the rice paddies and jungles. They were officers, senior non-commissioned officers, specialists in aviation, logistics, and amphibious doctrine. They were there to watch and to report, to be the eyes and ears of a distant government that was becoming increasingly invested in the outcome of this faraway conflict. They witnessed firsthand the French predicament, a technologically superior, conventional European army struggling to pin down a guerrilla force that melted into the landscape, a force that had the support, or at least the acquiescence, of a significant portion of the rural population. The reports they sent back were often prescient, noting the futility of the French strategy, the political weakness of the French-backed government, and the incredible tenacity of the Viet Minh. Yet, these warnings were largely filtered through the ideological lens of Washington, where the primary concern was not the nuances of Vietnamese nationalism, but the global chessboard of the Cold War. The defining moment of this era, the event that shattered the French will to continue, was the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The French High Command, in a stunning display of strategic arrogance, established a massive, isolated airland base deep in a valley in northwestern Vietnam, hoping to lure the Viet Minh into a conventional, set-piece battle where superior French firepower could annihilate them. The Viet Minh, under the brilliant command of General Vo Nguyen Giap, did the impossible. They dismantled heavy artillery pieces, hauled them by hand over mountains and through dense jungle, and reassembled them on the high ground, overlooking the French garrison. For 57 days, they pounded the French positions in a relentless siege. The French, cut off and unable to be resupplied, were systematically crushed. The fall of Dien Bien Phu was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological cataclysm. It signaled the end of French colonial rule in Indochina and led directly to the 1954 Geneva Accords. The Accords were a messy compromise, a temporary cessation of hostilities that partitioned Vietnam at the 17th parallel, creating a communist North and a nominally democratic, American-backed South, with the promise of nationwide elections in 1956 to reunify the country. Those elections would never happen. The United States, fearing a victory by Ho Chi Minh, supported the South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem's refusal to participate. And with that decision, the temporary dividing line of the 17th parallel began to harden into a permanent ideological frontier, and the stage was set for America to inherit the war the French had lost. The Marine Advisory role continued, shifting its focus to the fledgling South Vietnamese Marine Corps. But the fundamental nature of the conflict was changing, escalating from a post-colonial insurgency into a direct proxy war between superpowers. The Beachhead, Da Nang, March 1965. The decade following the Geneva Accords was one of slow, simmering escalation. The advisory effort grew, the financial investment deepened, and the political commitment hardened. The Viet Cong, the southern guerrilla force backed by North Vietnam, grew in strength and influence, waging a campaign of assassination, terror, and insurgency against the Saigon government. The American response was incremental, a series of half measures and optimistic projections that consistently failed to grasp the political and social realities of the conflict. By 1964, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, was proving to be ineffective and riddled with corruption, and the Viet Cong controlled vast swaths of the countryside. The political catalyst for direct American intervention came in August of that year, with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The details of the incident, which involved alleged attacks by North Vietnamese patrol boats on a US destroyer, remain controversial to this day. But in the charged atmosphere of 1964, it was all the justification President Lyndon B. Johnson needed. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution with near unanimous support, granting Johnson broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. The door to a ground war had been opened. The decision was made in the winter of 1964 to 65. After a series of Viet Cong attacks on American installations, most notably the bombing of a US barracks in Pleiku, the Johnson administration felt compelled to act decisively. The initial plan was for a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder. But the sprawling airbase at Da Nang, from which many of these strikes would be launched, was vulnerable to ground attack. General William Westmoreland, the commander of US forces in Vietnam, requested 2 battalions of United States Marines to protect it. On March 8, 1965, the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade landed at Da Nang. The moment of their arrival has become one of the most iconic and surreal images of the entire war. The Marines came ashore in full combat gear, storming the beach from landing craft, weapons at the ready, prepared for a hostile reception. Instead, they were met by the local mayor, a contingent of South Vietnamese officials, and a group of young Vietnamese women in traditional Ao Dai dresses who placed garlands of flowers around their necks. It was a perfectly orchestrated photo opportunity, a symbol of welcome and alliance. But it was also a profound and unsettling metaphor for the war itself, a projection of American power and good intentions colliding with a complex and alien reality that it did not fully comprehend. The initial mission of these Marines was strictly defined and defensive in nature. They were there to establish a security perimeter around the Da Nang airbase, to create a buffer against potential Viet Cong attacks. Their official rules of engagement were restrictive. They were to hold their ground, not to actively seek out and engage the enemy. This passive, defensive posture, however, ran contrary to the very ethos of the Marine Corps. The USMC is an organization built on the principle of the offensive, of seeking out and closing with the enemy. The idea of sitting and waiting in defensive positions was anathema to their training, their doctrine, and their institutional identity. It was a source of immense frustration for the commanders on the ground, who saw the enemy moving freely just beyond their perimeter, setting up ambushes, and controlling the local villages. It quickly became apparent to General Lewis Walt, the commander of the 3 Marine Amphibious Force, that a static defense was untenable. The security of the base, he argued, depended on the security of the surrounding area. To truly protect Da Nang, the Marines had to go out beyond the wire, to find the enemy and eliminate him, to pacify the villages from which he drew his strength and support. This logic was compelling, and it aligned with General Westmoreland's own desire to take the fight to the enemy. Within weeks of their arrival, the mission began to expand. The concept of base security was reinterpreted more and more broadly. The perimeter was pushed further out. Patrols became more aggressive, probing deeper into the countryside. The initial landing of 2 battalions was soon reinforced by more. Other enclaves were established along the coast, at Chu Lai and Phu Bai. By the summer of 1965, less than 6 months after the first Marines had waded ashore, the mission had fundamentally changed. It was no longer about defense. It was about offense. It was about finding, fixing, and destroying the enemy. The United States Marine Corps was no longer just securing a beachhead. It was taking ownership of a war. The initial, cautious step had led to a commitment that would last for a decade and would see hundreds of thousands of Marines cycle through the country, fighting a conflict that would test them in ways they could never have imagined on that sunny, flower-strewn beach in Da Nang. A war of firsts, Operation Starlite. By August 1965, the Marine presence in South Vietnam had grown substantially, and the frustration with a purely defensive posture had reached a boiling point. The Viet Cong were becoming bolder, and intelligence reports indicated that the 1st VC Regiment, a main force unit of some 2,000 hardened fighters, had massed on the Van Tuong Peninsula, just 15 miles south of the Marine Air Base at Chu Lai. Their objective, it was believed, was to attack the base. For the Marine commanders, this was not a threat to be waited out. It was an opportunity to be seized. Here was a chance to use their full strength, to bring their conventional firepower and amphibious doctrine to bear on a significant enemy formation, and to prove the value of a more aggressive strategy. The result was Operation Starlite, a landmark engagement that would set the tone for the early years of the American ground war. It was a war of firsts, the first major regimental-sized battle for American forces since the Korean War, and the first major test of the US military against a Viet Cong main force unit. The plan for Operation Starlite was a classic Marine Corps operation, a textbook example of a combined arms assault. It was designed as a hammer and anvil strike. 1 battalion would be landed by helicopter to the west of the peninsula, setting up a blocking position to prevent the enemy from escaping inland. Another battalion would conduct an amphibious landing from the sea to the southeast, driving the Viet Cong northward. A 3rd battalion would attack southward from the direction of Chu Lai, completing the encirclement. Naval gunfire from destroyers offshore, close air support from Marine jets, and artillery from the Chu Lai base would pound the trapped enemy. The operation was launched on August 18th. From the outset, it was a brutal and chaotic affair. The helicopter landing zone for the Western blocking force turned out to be hot, with the Marines taking heavy fire as soon as they touched down. The amphibious landing to the south was met with fierce resistance from well-entrenched Viet Cong positions. The fighting that ensued over the next several days was intense and vicious. The Viet Cong were not the shadowy hit-and-run guerrillas the Marines had been chasing on small unit patrols. These were disciplined, well-equipped soldiers who stood their ground, who had honeycombed the peninsula with tunnels, trenches, and camouflaged fighting positions. They were masters of ambush and concealment. The Marines had to root them out one position at a time in close-quarters combat under the punishing Vietnamese sun. The technological superiority of the Americans was undeniable. The sheer volume of firepower they could bring to bear from the air, sea, and land was staggering. But the human element, the will to fight, was a great equalizer. The Marines were shocked by the tenacity of their opponents, by their willingness to fight and die almost to the last man. After 6 days of relentless fighting, Operation Starlite was over. On paper, it was a resounding American victory. The Marine Corps reported over 600 Viet Cong killed, against 45 Marines killed and over 200 wounded. The 1st VC Regiment had been shattered as a fighting force. The immediate threat to the Chu Lai Air Base was eliminated. The operation was hailed as a great success, a validation of the new, aggressive strategy. It seemed to prove that American firepower and tactics could defeat the enemy in a head-on confrontation. But beneath the surface of this tactical victory lay a more sobering strategic lesson. The Marines had won the battle, but the enemy had not been permanently defeated. The VC, though battered, would reconstitute. They had shown that they were not afraid to engage American forces, that they could absorb massive losses and continue the fight. And perhaps most importantly, the operation revealed the fundamental challenge of the war. The Marines could clear an area, as they had on the Van Tuong Peninsula. But could they hold it? Once the American forces left, what was to stop the Viet Cong from simply returning, rebuilding their networks, and reasserting their control over the population? Operation Starlite was a victory, but it was a victory in a vacuum. It was a demonstration of how to win a battle, but it offered no clear answer on how to win the war. I Corps, the Marines' War. To understand the unique character of the Marine Corps' war in Vietnam, one must first understand the geography of the conflict. South Vietnam was divided into 4 military regions, or Corps tactical zones. The southernmost region, I Vol Corps, was the flat, marshy expanse of the Mekong Delta. 3 Corps contained the capital, Saigon. 2 Corps comprised the rugged Central Highlands. And the northernmost region, bordering the demilitarized zone, DMZ, that separated North and South Vietnam, was I Corps. This was the region assigned to the United States Marines, and it was, without question, the most challenging and dangerous theater of operations in the entire country. I Corps and the Marines became almost synonymous during the war. It was here that the vast majority of Marines served, and it was here that the conflict was fought in its most intense and varied forms. The strategic importance of I Corps was immense. It was the geographic buffer between the communist north and the major population centres of the south. Its long western border with Laos was a primary infiltration route for the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the logistical artery that supplied the war in the south with men and materiel from the north. Its proximity to the DMZ meant that it was under the constant threat of a conventional cross-border invasion by large units of the North Vietnamese Army, NVA. Unlike the rest of South Vietnam, where the primary adversary was often the guerrilla Viet Cong, the Marines in I Corps faced a dual threat: a persistent, deeply entrenched VC insurgency within the populated coastal lowlands, and the ever-present danger of NVA regular divisions massing just across the border. This unique combination of threats forced the Marines to fight what was essentially 2 different wars at the same time. The terrain of I Corps was as varied as it was unforgiving. The coastal plain was a patchwork of rice paddies, fishing villages, and densely populated cities like Da Nang, Hue, and Quang Tri. This was the heart of the counterinsurgency war, a struggle for control of the population, a war among the people fought in hamlets and marketplaces. West of this coastal strip, the terrain rose sharply into a series of jungle-covered mountains and steep, razor-backed ridges, a wilderness that was sparsely populated but heavily used by the enemy as base areas and infiltration routes. This was the domain of the conventional war, a conflict of large unit sweeps, brutal hill fights, and helicopter assaults into remote, hostile territory. The climate was equally extreme, with a scorching dry season and a drenching monsoon season that turned the landscape into a sea of mud and made air support, the Marines' greatest advantage, unreliable. This 2-war dilemma placed an incredible strain on the 3 Marine amphibious force. Resources were constantly being shifted between the 2 efforts. A battalion that was conducting pacification operations in the coastal villages, 1 week, could find itself airlifted into the Western Mountains, the next to engage an NVA regiment. The strategic priorities were in constant conflict. General Westmoreland and his headquarters in Saigon, MACV, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, consistently prioritized the big war against the NVA. The primary metric of success for MACV was the body count, the strategy of attrition. The belief was that if the US could kill enemy soldiers faster than the North could replace them, the Communists would eventually lose their will to fight. The Marine leadership, particularly General Victor Brute Krulak, a fierce advocate for counterinsurgency, often disagreed with this approach. They argued that the real center of gravity in the war was not the NVA divisions in the mountains, but the Vietnamese peasant in the rice paddies. They believed that the war would be won or lost in the villages, and they championed a strategy of pacification, of providing security for the population and winning their loyalty, thereby denying the Viet Cong their base of support. This fundamental strategic disagreement between the Marines and the Army High Command would be a source of constant friction throughout the war and would shape the unique and often contradictory nature of the Marines' experience in I Corps. The hill fights and the Ring of Steel. As the war escalated through 1966 and 1967, the fighting in Y Corps grew increasingly savage. The strategy of attrition dictated a focus on killing the enemy, and the enemy, in the form of NVA regular divisions, was increasingly present just north of the demilitarized zone. This led to a series of some of the most brutal and sustained battles of the war, fought for control of seemingly insignificant hills and outposts that held immense strategic value. Places like Con Thien, nicknamed the Hill of Angels, and the hills surrounding the Khe Sanh combat base became grinding, close-quarters slugfests, defined by constant artillery bombardment, trench warfare, and infantry assaults against heavily fortified positions. This was not the counterinsurgency war of the coastal plains. This was conventional warfare at its most primordial, reminiscent of the great artillery duels of the First World War. The area just south of the DMZ became known as Leatherneck Square. Here, the Marines established a string of combat bases and fire bases intended to act as a barrier against NVA infiltration. Con Thien was one of the anchors of this line. From this small, elevated piece of ground, Marine artillery could dominate the surrounding area. For precisely that reason, the NVA were determined to neutralize it. For months in 1967, they subjected the base to a relentless barrage of artillery, rocket, and mortar fire from their own well-concealed positions north of the DMZ. The Marines holding the hill lived in a hellscape of trenches and bunkers, under constant threat of bombardment. The NVA would launch periodic ground assaults, probing the defences, leading to vicious, hand-to-hand fighting. The Marines, in turn, would launch operations outside the wire to try and silence the enemy guns. It was a bloody, attritional stalemate, where success was measured not in territory gained, but in the grim calculus of the body count. Further west, in the remote, mountainous corner of Y Corps near the Laotian border, another focal point was emerging: the Khe Sanh combat base. Established on a plateau surrounded by high, jungle-covered hills, Khe Sanh was intended to be a patrol base for monitoring NVA infiltration along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, an anchor for special forces operations in the area, and a potential jumping-off point for future operations into Laos. As the NVA presence in the area grew throughout 1967, the strategic importance of Khe Sanh increased. A series of brutal battles, known as the Hill Fights, erupted in the spring of that year for control of the high ground overlooking the base. Hills with numerical designations like 881 South, 881 North, and 861 became the sites of intense, seesaw battles as the Marines fought to dislodge entrenched NVA forces. These battles were a grim foretaste of what was to come. The NVA were dug in, with extensive bunker and trench systems. The Marines had to assault these positions frontally, up steep, jungle-choked slopes, into a hail of machine gun fire and mortars. Air and artillery support were crucial, but in the end, It came down to the rifleman, the grunt, closing with and destroying the enemy in his bunker. The Marines ultimately took the hills, but at a heavy cost. The experience of the hill fights convinced General Westmoreland of Khe Sanh's importance. He saw it as the perfect opportunity to lure the NVA into a major, set-piece battle where he could bring the full weight of American air power to bear. He reinforced the base, improved its defenses, and created what he called a ring of steel around it. He was convinced that the NVA were preparing for a major assault on Khe Sanh, an attempt to replicate their victory at Dien Bien Phu. He was right that the NVA were coming. But he was wrong about their ultimate objective. All through the latter half of 1967, as the Marines dug in and prepared for a siege, the NVA were quietly moving tens of thousands of troops into position, not just around Khe Sanh, but across the length and breadth of South Vietnam. The stage was being set for a gamble of epic proportions, a nationwide offensive that would aim to shatter the American will to fight and collapse the government of South Vietnam in a single, decisive stroke. Midpoint. The shattering, January 1968. The question revisited. And so we arrive at the precipice, the end of 1967. The United States Marine Corps has been engaged in full-scale combat operations in Vietnam for nearly 3 years. At home, the American public is being told that there is light at the end of the tunnel. They are shown statistics, body counts, and maps with arrows that all point toward inevitable victory. The Marines, and the US military as a whole, are winning every tactical engagement. Yet, the number of troops required keeps increasing. The casualties continue to mount. The enemy, despite being repeatedly shattered and decimated, continues to fight with undiminished ferocity. This brings us back to our central question, now infused with a sense of impending crisis. If the United States Marine Corps, with its overwhelming technological and logistical superiority, was winning on every battlefield, why did the war itself feel like an unwinnable quagmire? Why did the light at the end of the tunnel seem to be receding rather than approaching? The answer was about to explode across South Vietnam in a way that would shatter every assumption upon which the American war effort was based. The year 1968 would be the fulcrum upon which the entire conflict turned, and it would begin in the mud and fog of Khe Sanh. The devil in the details. The siege of Khe Sanh begins. By January 1968, the intelligence was undeniable. At least 2, and possibly as many as 4, NVA divisions, some 20,000 to 40,000 men, had encircled the isolated Marine combat base at Khe Sanh. The base itself, along with its outlying hill outposts, was defended by roughly 6,000 Marines. The parallels to Dien Bien Phu were obvious and alarming. An isolated Western force surrounded in a valley by a massive Vietnamese army that controlled the high ground. For President Johnson, watching from the White House, the fear of a similar disaster was palpable. He had a scale model of the Khe Sanh Plateau built in the Situation Room and demanded assurances from the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the base should not fall. For General Westmoreland, however, this was not a crisis, but the ultimate opportunity. This was the battle he had been waiting for, the chance to destroy a significant portion of the NVA in a conventional fight where American air power would be the decisive factor. He initiated Operation Niagara, a massive, concentrated bombing campaign that would unleash an unprecedented amount of ordnance on the area surrounding the base. The stage was set for the most famous siege of the Vietnam War. The siege began in earnest on January 21, 1968. A massive NVA artillery barrage slammed into the base, hitting the main ammunition dump and setting off a chain of catastrophic explosions. The main runway was damaged, isolating the base from all but the most daring C-130 supply flights. For the next 77 days, the Marines at Khe Sanh endured a living hell. They lived in trenches and bunkers, under a near-constant rain of enemy artillery, rockets, and mortars. The NVA launched periodic ground probes and assaults, particularly against the outlying hill positions, leading to some of the most desperate and heroic small unit actions of the war. Life became a primal struggle for survival. The red laterite soil of the plateau was churned into a lunar landscape of craters and mud. The fog and monsoon clouds often shrouded the base, grounding air support and adding to the sense of claustrophobic isolation. From the American perspective, the defense of Khe Sanh became a national obsession. The media covered the siege minute by minute. It was portrayed as a symbol of American resolve, a test of will against the communist aggressor. And in purely military terms, the defense was a staggering success. Operation Niagara was brutally effective. B-52s, flying in 3 plane formations known as arc lights, carpet-bombed the surrounding area around the clock. Tactical fighter bombers dropped napalm and high explosives with pinpoint accuracy, guided by controllers on the ground. It is estimated that over 100,000 tons of bombs were dropped during the siege, the most concentrated application of aerial firepower on a single target in the history of warfare. The NVA losses were horrific, estimated in the many thousands. The base never fell. The Marines held their ground. But as the world's attention was riveted on this dramatic siege in a remote corner of Vietnam, the real storm was about to break everywhere else. The Great Deception, the Tet Offensive erupts. On the night of January 30th, 1968, during the truce declared for the Tet holiday, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive. It was an operation of breathtaking audacity and scale. Some 80,000 communist troops launched simultaneous attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, from the DMZ in the north to the Mekong Delta in the south. The attacks were designed to be a popular uprising, to show the South Vietnamese people that the Saigon government and its American allies could not protect them, and to spark a general revolution that would overthrow the government and force the Americans to withdraw. In Saigon, a VC suicide squad blasted its way into the compound of the US Embassy, the very symbol of American power and prestige, leading to a 6-hour firefight that was broadcast live into the living rooms of a stunned American public. The Tet Offensive was a catastrophic intelligence failure for the United States. Despite some warning signs, the scope, intensity, and coordination of the attacks caught MACV and the White House completely by surprise. The narrative that the enemy was on the ropes, that the war was being won, was exposed as a lie in a single violent night. In I Corps, the situation was particularly dire. The ancient imperial capital of Hue was overrun and captured by NVA and VC forces. The city of Quang Tri was attacked. Even the massive marine base at Da Nang came under rocket and ground assault. It became terrifyingly clear that the massive NVA build-up around Khe Sanh had been, at least in part, a brilliant strategic diversion. By focusing American attention and resources on a single remote outpost, the North Vietnamese had drawn the eyes of their enemy away from the true targets, the supposedly secure cities and population centers of the South. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disastrous defeat for the Communists. The popular uprising they had hoped to inspire never materialized. Their losses were catastrophic, particularly for the Viet Cong, whose political and military infrastructure in the South was decimated and would never fully recover. Within a few weeks, American and South Vietnamese forces had retaken all of the captured cities and inflicted immense casualties on the attackers. But the war was not just a military contest, it was a political and psychological one. And in that arena, Tet was a stunning victory for North Vietnam. The images of chaos and destruction, of fighting in the streets of Saigon and Hue, directly contradicted the optimistic reports of the Johnson administration. The credibility gap between what the government was saying and what the public was seeing became an unbridgeable chasm. Prominent journalists, like Walter Cronkite, who had previously supported the war, now declared it a stalemate. Public support for the war plummeted. The Tet Offensive shattered the consensus that the war was winnable and set in motion a chain of events that would lead President Johnson to announce he would not seek re-election, to a halt in the bombing of North Vietnam, and to the beginning of peace talks in Paris. The siege of Khe Sanh would continue for another 2 months, and the base would ultimately be relieved, but its strategic importance had evaporated overnight. In a final bitter irony, just a few months after the siege was lifted, the US military dismantled and abandoned the Khe Sanh combat base. The ground that 6,000 Marines had so tenaciously defended, the symbol of American resolve, was quietly given back to the jungle. The shattering was complete. The war, and the Marine Corps' role in it, would never be the same. Act 2. A War of Contradictions, 1968 to 1971. Hell in a very small place, the battle for Khe City. While the world's attention was fixed on the dramatic siege at Khe Sanh, the true heart of the Tet Offensive in Y Corps was the battle for Khe. Khe was not just another provincial capital, it was the cultural and spiritual soul of Vietnam, the ancient seat of the Nguyen emperors. Its walled citadel, a fortress within the city, was a place of immense historical and symbolic importance. For the North Vietnamese, capturing Khe was a primary objective, a blow aimed not just at the military, but at the very identity of the South. On the first night of Tet, 10 battalions of NVA and Viet Cong troops infiltrated and overran the city, quickly seizing all of it except for a small, embattled compound of the ARVN 1st Division inside the citadel, and a small US MACV compound south of the Perfume River, which divided the city. The task of retaking Khe would fall to the United States Marines, and it would become one of the longest, bloodiest, and most destructive battles of the entire war. The initial American response was slow and piecemeal. The command in Y Corps, still focused on Khe Sanh and believing the reports from Khe were exaggerated, sent only a single company of Marines to relieve the MACV compound. That company was ambushed and shot to pieces as it tried to cross the river into the city. It was the first brutal indication that this was not a minor skirmish. This was a major, conventional battle for control of a city. What followed was 26 days of unrelenting, house-to-house, street-by-street urban combat. This was a type of warfare for which the Marines, trained for jungle operations and large unit sweeps, were largely unprepared. The narrow streets and dense masonry buildings of Khe negated many of the Americans' technological advantages. Air and artillery support were heavily restricted to avoid destroying the historic city, at least in the initial stages. It came down to the individual rifleman fighting with grenades, machine guns, and bayonets to clear one building, one room at a time. The NVA and VC defenders were well prepared and determined. They were dug into the thick stone walls of the citadel and the surrounding buildings, creating a lethal, interlocking network of machine gun nests and sniper positions. Every street became a killing zone. Progress was measured in yards, and the cost of each yard was paid in blood. The Marines had to relearn the forgotten art of urban warfare on the fly, developing new tactics for breaching walls, clearing rooms, and coordinating attacks in the claustrophobic urban environment. The fighting was relentless, with no front lines and no safe rear areas. Snipers were a constant threat. Ambushes were sprung from sewers and rooftops. The psychological toll on the young Marines was immense. The battle for Khe was a meat grinder, a place of intimate, personal violence that left deep scars on all who survived it. Slowly, painstakingly, the Marines and their ARVN allies began to push the enemy back. The restrictions on fire support were gradually lifted as the desperation of the situation became clear. The beautiful, historic city was systematically pulverized by bombs, napalm, and artillery. By the end of February, the last NVA defenders had been driven from the citadel, and the battle was over. The city was in ruins. But the greatest horror of the Battle of Khe was only discovered after the fighting had stopped. During their month-long occupation, The NVA and VC had systematically rounded up and executed thousands of civilians, government officials, intellectuals, priests, merchants, and anyone else deemed to be an enemy of the revolution. Mass graves were discovered all around the city. The massacre at Khe was a chilling reminder of the ideological fanaticism that underpinned the conflict and the brutal fate that awaited those who opposed the communists. For the Marines who had fought there, the victory was a bitter one. They had retaken the city, but at a terrible cost, both to themselves and to the city they had been sent to liberate. The other war, the Combined Action Program. Even as the Marines were engaged in the massive conventional battles of Khe Sanh and Hue, a different kind of war was being fought in the villages and hamlets of I-Corps. It was a quieter war, less dramatic, but in the eyes of many Marines, it was the more important one. This was the War of Pacification, and its most innovative and uniquely Marine expression was the Combined Action Program, or CAP. The program was born out of the early realization that the search and destroy strategy, while effective at killing the enemy, was doing little to win the loyalty of the Vietnamese people. A Marine battalion could sweep through a village, kill a few Viet Cong, and then leave, only to have the VC return that night to reassert their control through terror and intimidation. The real challenge was to provide permanent security at the village level, to separate the guerrillas from the population that sustained them. The concept of CAPI was simple but radical. It took a single 13-man Marine rifle squad, augmented by a Navy corpsman, and permanently embedded it in a Vietnamese village. This Marine squad was then combined with a 30-man platoon of local Vietnamese militia known as Popular Forces. Together, this combined platoon, or KP, lived in the village, ate with the people, patrolled the surrounding area day and night, and trained the local militia to defend their own homes. The goal was to build a bond of trust with the villagers, to show them that the government and its American allies were there to protect them, not just to pass through on their way to the next big battle. The CAP Marines became a part of the community. They learned the language, they helped with the harvest, they provided medical care, and they gained an intimate knowledge of the local area and its people. This allowed them to gather intelligence, to identify the local VC infrastructure, and to preempt enemy attacks. Life in a CAP unit was a world away from life in a line battalion. It was a 24-hour-a-day, 365-day-a-year commitment. There were no safe rear areas, no hot meals, no breaks from the tension. The CAP Marines were isolated, often miles from the nearest friendly unit, surrounded by an enemy that could be anyone, anywhere. They faced constant danger from snipers, booby traps, and nighttime raids. But they also experienced a side of Vietnam that few other Americans ever saw. They built genuine relationships with the Vietnamese people. They saw the war not as a series of abstract objectives on a map, but as a deeply personal struggle for the security and well-being of a specific community. They were fighting what many of them called the other war, a war measured not in body counts, but in the number of children who could safely attend school, the number of farmers who could tend their fields without fear, and the growing confidence of the local militia. The Combined Action Program was, by most accounts, a remarkable success on a tactical level. The villages protected by CAP units were significantly more secure and prosperous than their neighbours. The program produced excellent intelligence and was highly effective at neutralising the local VC apparatus. It was a model of effective counterinsurgency. However, it was never fully embraced by the American High Command. It was a small, resource-intensive program in a war that was being run on a massive scale. It didn't fit with the Army's conventional mindset or with MACV's focus on attrition. The metrics of CAP, trust, security, local development, were difficult to quantify and did not show up in the all-important body count statistics that were being sent back to Washington. As a result, the program remained a sideshow, a uniquely Marine Corps initiative that was never given the resources or the priority to make a strategic difference. It remains one of the great what-ifs of the Vietnam War, a tantalizing glimpse of a different, more nuanced approach that was ultimately overshadowed by the logic of the sledgehammer. The Mailed Fist, Operation Dewey Canyon. In the wake of the Tet Offensive, the American military was determined to regain the initiative and prove that it still controlled the battlefield. While the CAP units continued their quiet work in the villages, the Marine Corps also sought to demonstrate its conventional military prowess, its ability to strike deep into enemy sanctuaries and disrupt the NVA's logistical network. The epitome of this approach was Operation Dewey Canyon, launched in early 1969. It was the last major offensive conducted by the Marines in Vietnam and is widely considered to be a tactical masterpiece, the most successful helicopter-borne operation of the entire war. The target was the Khe Sanh Valley, a rugged, mountainous, and heavily jungled area in western Vietnam that straddled the border with Laos. The valley was a critical component of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a major NVA base area, and a staging ground for attacks into the coastal lowlands. The operation was a massive undertaking, involving the 9th Marine Regiment and a vast array of air and artillery support. The plan was to use helicopters to leapfrog Marine infantry from one mountain peak to the next, establishing a series of fire bases that would provide artillery support and serve as launch pads for patrols down into the valley floor. The challenges were immense. The terrain was some of the most difficult on Earth, with triple canopy jungle, steep mountains, and narrow valleys. The weather was atrocious, with constant rain and fog that made flying treacherous. And the NVA were present in force, with extensive anti-aircraft defences and well-prepared bunker complexes. Despite these obstacles, the operation was executed with remarkable skill and precision. The Marines, now seasoned veterans of helicopter warfare, moved with speed and audacity. The fire bases were established, and the patrols began to push into the valley, uncovering massive enemy supply caches. They found warehouses full of weapons, ammunition, food, and equipment. They discovered truck parks, maintenance facilities, and extensive networks of roads and trails. The sheer scale of the NVA logistical effort in the Khe Sanh Valley was a revelation. For weeks, the Marines systematically destroyed these caches, dealing a major blow to the NVA's ability to supply their forces in the region. The fighting was sporadic but intense, with the Marines clashing with NVA units guarding the supply depots. The most controversial aspect of Operation Dewey Canyon was its inevitable extension across the border into Laos. The NVA base areas did not respect international borders, and some of the most significant supply routes and caches were located just inside Laotian territory. Although US ground troops were officially forbidden from entering Laos, the Marine commanders on the ground, in a classic example of mission creep and military necessity, sent small reconnaissance teams and eventually larger units across the border to pursue the enemy and destroy his supplies. These incursions were officially denied, but were an open secret. They highlighted the fundamental strategic dilemma of the war. The enemy enjoyed the sanctuary of neutral territory, while American forces were constrained by political boundaries. Operation Dewey Canyon was, by any tactical measure, a stunning success. The Marines had inflicted heavy losses on the enemy, captured or destroyed thousands of tons of supplies, and disrupted a critical logistical hub. It was a textbook demonstration of the power and mobility of an airmobile force. And yet, like Operation Starlite years before, its strategic impact was fleeting. The Marines could raid the Khe Sanh Valley, but they could not stay there. Once they withdrew, the NVA simply returned and rebuilt. The operation was a powerful blow, a mailed fist that struck deep into the enemy's heartland, but it was a blow against a system that was vast, redundant, and resilient. It was another battle won in a war that was being lost, a final, powerful display of Marine Corps tactical excellence in a conflict where tactical excellence alone would not be enough. Climax, the synthesis. Attrition versus pacification, a false dichotomy? As we synthesize the disparate threads of the Marine Corps' experience in Vietnam, we are confronted by a central, defining tension: the conflict between two fundamentally different philosophies of warfare. On one side was the strategy of attrition, the dominant paradigm of the American military command. This was the war of the big battalions, of search and destroy, of overwhelming firepower. Its logic was industrial, its metric the body count. It viewed the war as a mathematical equation. If we could inflict casualties at a rate higher than the enemy's ability to replace them, his will to resist would eventually be broken. This was the thinking that led to the bloody hill fights, the massive bombing of Khe Sanh, and the powerful raids like Operation Dewey Canyon. It was a strategy that played to American strengths in technology, logistics, and conventional firepower. On the other side was the strategy of pacification, the philosophy that underpinned the Combined Action Program. This was the war for the hearts and minds of the people. Its logic was political and social, its metric the security of the village. It viewed the war not as a contest of body counts, but as a struggle for legitimacy and control at the grassroots level. It argued that the enemy was not the NVA soldier in the jungle, but the VC guerrilla who lived among the people, and that the only way to defeat him was to win the trust and loyalty of the population he sought to control. This was a strategy that required patience, cultural understanding, and a long-term commitment to a specific community. It was a strategy that was, in many ways, antithetical to the American way of war. The tragedy of the Marine Corps' war in Vietnam, and indeed of the entire American effort, is that these two strategies were never effectively reconciled. They were pursued simultaneously, but separately, often working at cross purposes. A cap squad might spend months painstakingly building a relationship with a village, only to have that trust shattered in an afternoon when a line battalion, operating on faulty intelligence, swept through the area and inflicted civilian casualties or property damage. The big war focus on body counts created perverse incentives, sometimes leading to the indiscriminate use of firepower and a tragic blurring of the lines between combatant and civilian. The war of attrition alienated the very people whose support was essential to the success of the war of pacification. In retrospect, it is clear that this was a false dichotomy. A successful strategy would have required an integration of both approaches. The mailed fist of conventional forces was necessary to keep the NVA divisions at bay and to provide a security shield behind which the patient work of pacification could take place. But the work of pacification was equally necessary to deny the enemy his popular base and to build a viable, self-sustaining South Vietnamese state. The failure was one of balance and priority. The American military command consistently prioritized the war of attrition, pouring the vast majority of its resources and attention into the big battles. Pacification was treated as a secondary ancillary effort, the other war. This failure of strategic vision meant that even as American forces were winning on the battlefield, they were often losing the more important political struggle in the villages. They were winning the battles, but failing to create the conditions for a lasting peace. The I-Corps dilemma. The strategic contradictions of the American war effort were felt nowhere more acutely than in I-Corps. The Marines' area of responsibility was a microcosm of the entire war, a place where all the complexities and challenges of the conflict converged. The very nature of their assignment presented them with a fundamentally impossible dilemma. They were tasked with two distinct and demanding missions, each of which would have been a monumental undertaking on its own. Their first mission was to defend the northern frontier of South Vietnam against a conventional invasion by the North Vietnamese Army. This required them to operate as a conventional military force, to establish a line of combat bases along the DMZ, to engage in large-scale battles, and to be prepared at all times to repel a multi-division attack. This was the War of Khe Sanh and the hill fights. Their second mission was to pacify the densely populated coastal region, to root out the deeply entrenched Viet Cong infrastructure, and to win the loyalty of the local population. This required them to operate as a counterinsurgency force, to conduct small unit patrols, to live in the villages, and to engage in the delicate and dangerous work of political and social development. This was the War of the Combined Action Program. The problem was that these two missions were not only different, but they were often in direct conflict with one another in terms of resources, manpower, and mindset. The troops and helicopters needed for a major operation in the Western Mountains were the same troops and helicopters needed for security patrols in the coastal lowlands. The aggressive, firepower-intensive mindset required to fight the NVA was often counterproductive in the nuanced environment of a pacification campaign. The Marines in Y Corps were stretched thin, constantly trying to be in two places at once, fighting two different enemies with two different sets of tactics. They were a force in between, a hybrid organization trying to adapt to a hybrid war. This dilemma was a direct result of the geography and the strategic realities of their assigned area. They did not have the luxury of choosing to fight one war or the other. They were compelled to fight both. This constant shifting of focus, this perpetual struggle to balance two irreconcilable priorities, defined the character of their war. It led to a sense of frustration and futility, a feeling that they were fighting with one hand tied behind their back. The I Corps dilemma was, in essence, the Vietnam War in miniature. A conflict with no clear front lines, no single identifiable enemy, and no simple, unifying strategy for victory. The legacy of Vietnamization. By 1969, the political landscape of the war had shifted dramatically. The Tet Offensive had shattered the political will in Washington to pursue a military victory. The new administration of President Richard Nixon came into office with a mandate to end the war, but to do so with peace with honor. The new strategy was called Vietnamization. Its goal was to gradually withdraw American combat troops while simultaneously building up the South Vietnamese military to the point where it could defend itself. For the Marines in Y Corps, this meant a fundamental change in their mission. Their primary role was no longer to defeat the enemy, but to train and equip their South Vietnamese counterparts to take over the fight. The process of withdrawal began in the summer of 1969. The first Marine units began to stand down and ship out. For those who remained, the nature of the war changed. Large-scale offensive operations became less frequent. The focus shifted to providing security for the pacification program and advising ARVN and South Vietnamese Marine units. It was a difficult and often frustrating period. The American Marines had spent years fighting and bleeding for ground that they were now being asked to turn over. There was a pervasive sense of a job left unfinished, a feeling that their sacrifices were being squandered by a political decision made half a world away. The process of Vietnamization itself was fraught with challenges. While many South Vietnamese units fought with courage and distinction, the ARVN as an institution was plagued by systemic problems: corruption, poor leadership, and political interference. The American effort to build a modern, conventional army in the image of itself often failed to account for the political and cultural realities of South Vietnam. The ARVN became heavily dependent on American air power and logistical support, a dependency that would prove fatal when that support was withdrawn. For the individual Marine on the ground during this period, the war became a strange and dangerous twilight struggle. The fighting continued, men continued to die, but the sense of purpose, the belief in an ultimate victory, was gone. The new goal was simply to survive, to complete one's tour, and to go home. By the end of 1971, the last Marine combat units had been withdrawn from Vietnam. All that remained was a small contingent of advisors and the Marine security guards at the American Embassy in Saigon. Conclusion: echoes in the long haul. The final bitter act, the fall of Saigon. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973, officially ending direct US military involvement in the Vietnam War. The agreement was a ceasefire in place, a fragile and cynical piece of diplomacy that allowed the United States to complete its withdrawal and to claim peace with honor. It left hundreds of thousands of North Vietnamese troops in control of large areas of the South. It was not a peace, it was an intermission. For 2 years, a tense and violent stalemate persisted. But in the spring of 1975, with the United States embroiled in the Watergate scandal and Congress having cut off military aid to the South, North Vietnam judged that the time was right for the final offensive. The NVA launched a massive, conventional invasion, spearheaded by tanks and heavy artillery. The South Vietnamese army, without the support of American air power and crippled by poor leadership and collapsing morale, disintegrated with shocking speed. City after city fell. The NVA advanced down the coast, the very same coast where the Marines had landed a decade earlier. The final, bitter act of the long drama played out in Saigon in April 1975. As the NVA tightened their encirclement of the capital, the United States launched Operation Frequent Wind, the final, chaotic evacuation of American personnel and at-risk South Vietnamese. The central stage for this last act was the American Embassy in Saigon. And on that stage, the United States Marines played their final role. The Marine security guards, along with reinforcements flown in from offshore, were tasked with maintaining security at the embassy compound as thousands of desperate Vietnamese civilians swarmed the walls, begging for a way out. For 18 hours, Marine helicopters, CH-53S and CH-46N, landed on the roof of the embassy and in the parking lot, ferrying evacuees to the safety of the US fleet waiting in the South China Sea. The images from that day are seared into the collective memory of the 20th century. The lines of desperate people, the overloaded helicopters, the Marine on the rooftop gesturing to a helicopter that there is no more room. The last helicopter to lift off the embassy roof carried the remaining Marines of the security detachment. It was April 30th, 1975. The Vietnam War for the United States was over. The final thesis and broader implications. The story of the United States Marine Corps in Vietnam is a story of a crucible. It is a story of an elite fighting force forged in the amphibious assaults of the Pacific and the frozen mountains of Korea, being thrust into a conflict for which it was institutionally and doctrinally unprepared. The war in Vietnam was not one war, but many. It was a conventional war against a disciplined, well-equipped regular army. It was a counterinsurgency war against a shadowy, elusive guerrilla force. It was a political war for the loyalty of a civilian population. It was a war of attrition, a war of pacification, a war of advanced technology, and a war of primitive booby traps. The Marines were forced to fight all of these wars simultaneously, often with conflicting strategies and limited resources. Their struggle to adapt to this complex and contradictory environment is the central theme of their 25-year involvement. They demonstrated tactical brilliance in operations like Starlite and Dewey Canyon. They showed remarkable innovation in programs like the Combined Action Program. They displayed incredible courage and resilience in the face of unimaginable horror at places like Khe Sanh and Hue City. They won virtually every tactical engagement they fought. And yet, in the end, it was not enough. The war was not a purely military problem, it was a political one. And it was a political problem that could not be solved by military means alone. The Marine Corps' experience in Vietnam was a painful lesson in the limits of military power. It demonstrated that tactical success does not automatically translate into strategic victory, especially in a conflict where the political and social dimensions are paramount. The war forced the Corps into a long and difficult period of institutional soul-searching, a re-evaluation of its doctrine, its training, and its very identity. The echoes of Vietnam can still be heard in the long halls of the Marine Corps today, in its emphasis on small unit leadership, its focus on the strategic corporal, and its deep-seated understanding that the next war may be nothing like the last. The legacy of the Vietnam War is vast and complex, and it continues to shape American foreign policy and military thought. The Marine Corps' experience, in particular, offers a number of enduring lessons. It serves as a powerful reminder that not all conflicts are susceptible to conventional military solutions. The wars of the 21st century, like the war in Vietnam, are often wars among the people. where the struggle for legitimacy and popular support is as important, if not more important, than the struggle on the battlefield. The success of the Combined Action Program and its ultimate failure to be adopted as a mainstream strategy highlights the persistent tension within large military bureaucracies between conventional and unconventional approaches to warfare. The war also underscored the immense human cost of protracted conflicts, not just in terms of casualties, but in the psychological and moral toll they take on the individuals who fight them. The generation of Marines who served in Vietnam came home to a divided and often hostile nation, their sacrifices misunderstood and unappreciated. Their struggle to heal, both individually and collectively, has had a profound impact on how America views its veterans and its responsibilities to them. Ultimately, the story of the Marines in Vietnam is a human story. It is a story of courage, sacrifice, and adaptation in the face of a complex and unforgiving conflict. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris, the limits of power, and the tragic consequences of misunderstanding the nature of the war you are fighting. For further exploration, for those who wish to delve deeper into this complex subject, the literature is vast and rich. The personal experiences of the Marines who fought there are powerfully captured in memoirs like A Rumour of War by Philip Caputo and Fields of Fire by James Webb, both of whom served as Marine infantry officers in Vietnam. Bing West's The Village provides an unparalleled ground-level account of the Combined Action Program. For a broader historical and strategic overview, the works of historians like Bernard B. Fall, particularly Street Without Joy, and Stanley Karno's seminal Vietnam, A History, are indispensable. The official histories produced by the Marine Corps History Division offer meticulous, detailed accounts of every major operation and are an invaluable resource for serious researchers. These sources, taken together, provide a multifaceted and deeply human portrait of the Leatherneck's Labyrinth. Data infusion complete. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and stay curious.